Hello, and welcome back to Young Lung Cancer Initiative's Patient Education Series on the KRAS mutation. We have discussed with Dr. Negrao what KRAS is, just in general, that oncogene, and then what are the current treatments for KRAS patients. What we'd like to do today is kind of learn a little bit more about what's coming down the pipeline for patients dealing with KRAS mutations. That's where the excitement lies because we always want more, better, and newer treatments so that we can ultimately live longer and experience life to its fullest. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Negrao and let him share with you what is on the horizon for KRAS.
Thank you, Leah. And again, good morning, everyone. So for this part, which is one that I'm particularly excited about, I'm going to break it down into two parts. So first off, we're going to talk about the KRAS G12C mutations, which we already explored some and talked about some. And then the second part will be around the non-G12C mutations, which is one that still doesn't have any approved therapies, but with some very exciting compounds in the horizon. So starting off with KRAS G12C, we covered the limitations that we have with immunotherapy plus or minus chemotherapy. We covered the progress that the current G12C inhibitors that are commercially available and approved, what they represent. But we also made it clear that despite the excitement and the progress that we've made, there are still limitations for these types of treatments. So what are we now trying to do to push the boundaries and develop better therapies? So 2 points to make here. So there's two particular drugs that I think are showing themselves to be quite promising in the frontline setting. So patients with advanced cancer that have never been treated, right? So the first one is a drug called olomorasib. It's a drug that's been shown in combination with immunotherapy, for instance, to produce very high response rates around the 70% range in terms of chances of shrinking the cancer in patients that were previously untreated. And now this drug has moved on into a registrational phase 3, so a definitive trial for approval of this drug for patients with advanced KRAS G12C mutant non-small cell lung cancer. So this is a trial that's been published and presented, the design of the study, of course, because the study doesn't have results. It's a 2-part phase 3 study where you get allocated to those 2 parts based on your PD-L1 expression and in your treatment decisions with your physician. So if you have a PD-L1 high expression, meaning that you're more likely to respond to immunotherapy by yourself, patients can receive either olomorasib plus pembrolizumab, so a PD-1 inhibitor, or pembrolizumab plus placebo. So that's the first part of that study. And then there's a second part to that study, and that's for PD-L1 all comers, so 0 to 100. And then patients receive either olomorasib plus carboplatin, pemetrexed, and pembrolizumab, which is one of our standard treatments for frontline treatment of G12C mutant lung cancer, or placebo plus carboplatin, pemetrexed, and pembrolizumab. So that's a global study, but we are fortunate enough to have that study activated at MD Anderson. We're currently enrolling new patients to that study. And I think that this has a very real chance of changing and redefining the treatment paradigm for patients with advanced KRAS G12C mutant lung cancer. There's a second drug that's also in the frontline setting and being investigated for G12C lung cancers, which is called divarasib. That's a drug that's a little bit further behind in terms of clinical development, but has shown very promising activity as a single agent in the second line setting, so currently at least superior to what we've seen with adagrasib and sotorasib, which are the 2 approved drugs. And that drug is also being combined with pembrolizumab and is also under active investigation both here at MD Anderson as well as other sites.
Right. So these new drugs that you're talking about that are, trial phases, are they an oral TKI that you take daily and not an infusion?
That is correct. So all these drugs that we've discussed, all the G12C inhibitors that we've mentioned here, they're all oral therapies. And the interesting thing about these, let's call them second generation because they're more selective, they're more potent G12C inhibitors, is that they've also been shown to have a more favorable tolerability profile than the predecessors. So a lot of excitement around these drugs. And then I think that, like I said, because we said that the outlook for with our standard therapies are still not where we want them to be, I think these represent very important and treatment options for our patients.
Yes, that's really exciting that there's so many choices. When you think of two, you don't think that as being so many, but in lung cancer world, that's a lot. We'll take it. That's a win. So when we hear about the trial, do you know if you received the placebo, or is it blind where you don't know if you're getting the placebo?
For the olomorasib trial, it is blinded, and it is blinded including to the physicians.
Okay.
But I think that this is one of the unique opportunities, Leah, where, like, worst case scenario, you're getting the best we have, period.
Right.
And then at the end of the day, you still have at least a 50% chance of getting another treatment that's more promising. And that actually takes me to, we talked about the front line, but let's talk a little bit about the salvage setting. So the second line, right? So I know that a lot of patients get concerned, like, well, what if I get the placebo? But that's why we also have very interesting and promising options in the second line setting as well. So we were talking just now about divarasib. So there is another phase three, that definitive registration trial, that's actually comparing divarasib with adagrasib or sotorasib. It's a physician's choice decision based on what they would feel would be best for that patient. So you would still have the opportunity of getting the KRAS inhibitor in the second line setting as well. And if you say, well, but I want to make sure that I'm getting a very potent G12C inhibitor in the second line setting, especially if I'm at a 50% chance of not getting it in the front line setting. So, one of the other drugs that's been showing itself to be quite interesting and quite promising, and it doesn't have a name yet, it's called FMC 376. So, that's a very potent on and off inhibitor of KRAS that's also being developed in the second line setting, and that one is not randomized. That would be a drug that if you go into the trial, you will get the drug, period. And that's a drug and that's a study that we're going to have open at MD Anderson in the very, very near future. Okay? So we're in the final stages of activating that. So that, I think, also represents a very promising opportunity for our patients. And one point to note here is, I said, well, an on-off inhibitor. What do you mean by that, Dr. Negrao? So all the other G12C inhibitors that we just talked about, they have this particular feature where they act by locking the KRAS G12C protein in their off state. So that switch that you turn on and off, you basically like cap that. You can't turn it on anymore, and that's how we shut it down. But that creates a potential vulnerability, right? Because if you just say, what if the cell adapts and says, okay, you blocked it, I'll just produce more and just overrun you with it. That's a potential way that these cells can become resistant to the G12C inhibitors, and multiple groups have shown this either clinically or preclinically. So that's the potential benefit of you having an on-off inhibitor, because you're blocking that off state, so you cap that, but you also overcome the potential for, like, okay, I will just produce more. Okay, I got you there as well. So there's a lot of excitement about these new drugs that are potentially on-off inhibitors, and FMC 376 is one of the ones that's currently being developed that has that dual mechanism of action. And I think one of the other opportunities that I would highlight, and I think that this is probably one of more of interest for patients that have failed a G12C inhibitor, whatever one of these that we just discussed. So there is another compound which is called RMC 6291, which is an on-state G12C inhibitor, and it's being combined with a pan-RAS inhibitor. So now you're blocking not only KRAS, but also HRAS, NRAS, which are other proteins that function similar to KRAS. And when you combine these two, what we believe is that you may be able to overcome some mechanisms of resistance to what you get if you were only using the G12C alone. So all of these trials, all these opportunities are available to patients here at MD Anderson. We've made a priority to really focus in innovative, novel therapies that can give the patients as many options for an effective treatment, and that could potentially, like I said, push the bar and really transform the way that we currently treat KRAS G12C mutant lung cancer.
When patients hear trials, a lot of people assume that that means this is your last ditch effort. So we've learned that that's not always the case. I mean, you kind of hope to get there before you're to the point where it's dire need for that drug. So could you kind of explain when would be a good time to start implementing or trying to become part of this trial? Is as soon as you're diagnosed? I know for the first line, maybe it is, but with the second line, how do you kind of make that choice?
I think one thing that's very important here, Leah, is to outline that the way that we've gotten to immunotherapy, chemoimmunotherapy, G12C inhibitors, the way that we were able to make this progress is through clinical trials, right? So none of these therapies would be available. None of these therapies would have been approved if we didn't do our work in terms of doing these clinical trials to ultimately get these to show the benefit and get this to patients, right? So I think that that's the first important point to make. And I think the second important point to make is it brings us back to the points that we made earlier. I mean, yes, we've made a lot of progress. These are promising therapies, but most patients are going to have suboptimal outcomes with our standard therapies, right? So there's still a continued need for better, more effective therapies to give the patients the best chance of long-term survival and optimal quality of life, which for most part will come hand in hand with having the cancer under control. That's going to be, for most patients, the biggest source of symptoms and worsening of their quality of life. So, at least in my perspective, with the clear limitations that we currently have with our therapies, I think it's always wise to think about a clinical trial and discuss that with your doctor to see if that would be something that would be of benefit to you. And I think for a lot of these types of lung cancers, particularly to KRAS, I think most patients would derive some benefit of a clinical trial, whether it be in their frontline treatment, in their second line treatment, and in the third line treatment, and so on.
Okay, good answer.
And then the third point that I would make to your previous questions, clinical trials means that I'm done. Like there's no hope. It's either this or hospice. That's not true. We're fortunate enough to have access to a lot of these very innovative trials, but we have patients that have gone through 6, 7, 8 lines of clinical trials, coupled with standard of care here and there. And that's where we're able to really extend the patient's life for a longer period of time. It's not very common for you to see home runs. Eventually you will, but it's not like the day-to-day. I wish it was, but it's not for the most part. But those base hits, okay, so those doubles, those triples sometimes, those are going to represent a true, meaningful, and significant improvement down the line in terms of the overall lifespan and in terms of sustaining the quality of life and the functionality of a patient for a longer period of time. So I by no means I would encourage patients to see this all, I'm done, this is my last ditch effort. No, it's another opportunity to actually be exposed to something that looks extremely promising. And for you individually as a patient, not for future generations, not for future patients with this, for you individually as a patient, it could represent a major game changer in terms of your prognosis and your overall outlook. And then to kind of wrap up the discussion, I'll be quicker here because this is a space that's a little bit less mature. So talking about the KRAS non-G12C space right now, right? So this is one where we don't really have specific inhibitors that are approved, but there are a lot of drugs that are looking quite promising and quite exciting. I think one that your community is probably quite familiar with is the RMC-6236, which is that pan-RAS inhibitor that we talked about. That's one that's the most mature at this point. And we are anticipating that phase 3 testing of that drug in the second line setting will commence in the very near future. And that is one that we're going to be directly involved in participating in. So that's something that should come live sometime during the spring as we're heading into it right now. There are a couple of other specific inhibitors that are starting to make their way. One example is RMC, which is a KRAS G12D inhibitor. That's starting to also look quite promising with response rate close to the 40% range. But there's a multitude of molecules that are now in clinical testing. A lot of these are still fairly early in their phase 1, meaning that we're still trying to understand like what the right dose is, what the side effects are. But those all represent opportunities for patients, especially those that failed our standard treatments, particularly chemoimmunotherapy. So there's several companies that are developing these inhibitors, and in our team here at MD Anderson is directly involved in these studies as well. So there will definitely be clinical trial opportunities for lung cancer patients with non-G12C mutations, whether it be in more mature, later down the line programs, or these earlier ones that are also looking very exciting and very promising.
And I think it's wonderful that these are things that are being developed. And I know a minute ago you said, you always should be discussing trials with your doctor. How would you suggest they find out about these trials?
Yeah, that I wish that was more straightforward than it is, Leah. So it's a very valid point that you're bringing up. What I always encourage patients is, if you're motivated, if you're interested in clinical research, right? I would just say, please refer me to MD Anderson. Please refer me to a major academic center where I can get a second opinion and see what my clinical trial opportunities would be. And then I can discuss with them and weigh the pros and cons of those approaches versus the standard treatment. I'm always very clear and very transparent with my patients. I mean, this is the standard. This is what it does. These are the limitations. These are the benefits, right? And these would be the opportunities. The way that I look at this is that patient, family, and medical team, we're actually a team, right? These are decisions, and this is a journey that we go through together. And we can always give our best medical advice and help you guys make the decisions that you feel align the best with your preferences, with your vision, with your life, with your families. So I think the easiest way, and the reason I say this is because clinicaltrials.gov, like a website that a lot of these trials are registered in, sometimes the institutions, they're not as easy and as thorough to get access to. So I think, so my recommendation and my suggestion to you and to the group would be, get a second opinion. Go to an academic center and see what your options are. And me and my team and I here, all of our group here is always open. Yeah, we're always here. We're always open to seeing patients and helping making these tough decisions, and also offering newer, innovative therapies that could be of benefit to the patients.
And that's wonderful because, I've always said, I think, I wasn't given the life expectancy of even 5 years when I was first diagnosed over 5 years ago. And I firmly believe the second opinion and third opinion, that I've gotten has gotten me where I am today. So that is something we try to drive home, just the importance of a second opinion. And this just kind of just reassures us that's the right thing.
And I'll be even a little bit more boldly. Talking about, like, we talked about clinical trials, right? Like dead end, like end of the road kind of thing. So one of the things to keep in mind is that clinical trials are not just available for patients with stage 4 disease, right? There are clinical trials for patients with early stage disease, right? And I mean, I think a lot of your community is aware of the impact that we're seeing now with adjuvant targeted therapies for EGFR and ALK, with osimertinib and alectinib, the incorporation now of immunotherapy in the neoadjuvant setting for patients that are EGFR and ALK wild type, so that don't have those markers. Right, that's now a definitively established therapy before surgery in combination with chemotherapy, right? And talking a bit about KRAS in this setting, so there is some data that even generated by our group showing that even with chemoimmunotherapy in the neoadjuvant setting before surgery, it's still not a very effective therapy for the KRAS population. So the data that we looked in our group with our patients here in our database suggests that patients with KRAS non-G12C mutations, their likelihood of what we call complete pathologic response, so full eradication of the cancer with chemoimmunotherapy, is actually 0. And that's an important marker that will tell you how these patients are going to do in the long run. If you reach a pathologic complete response, your likelihood of being cured from your lung cancer is extremely high. The most conservative assessment right now would be around probably 80%, right? But if you don't have that, then your odds become much, much worse. Right. And in the non-G12C population, you're talking about a chance of full eradication of the tumor with chemoimmunotherapy that hovers around about 14%.
Wow.
So it's a small portion of the patients that's actually gonna that's going to have like that big magnitude of benefit from these neoadjuvant therapies. And that's why a lot of these drugs that we talked about are going to be quickly moving into the adjuvant setting as well. So after surgery and even after concurrent chemoradiation for patients that have tumors that are not able to be removed surgically. So there will be in the very near future, and I say very, very near future, opportunities in those two disease settings, particularly for those patients where the chemoimmunotherapy didn't really do what we wanted it to in terms of getting that very bulk
Mhm.
tumor cell killing. There will be opportunities there with KRAS inhibitors that are going to be going after increasing chances of cure, similar to what you saw with osimertinib in the ADORA trial. So I think that that would be my final point on this clinical trial section is clinical trials are not just for end of the line, kind of last ditch Hail Mary efforts. These should be considered and should be discussed with your medical team at every step of your journey. And then when not available, that second opinion can be quite paramount to discuss the pros and cons of an investigational treatment versus a standard of care treatment.
And I think even people that don't, like me, without the KRAS mutation, are going to learn, even from just that little piece of saying, about the trial not being a Hail Mary, that it, it could be right for you before that. It should be, you want to get there before it's that last little bit because you're not healthy, you're not as healthy, not able to tolerate treatment as well and whatnot. So I think that's really great information. And I know we've kept you longer than we anticipated today. And I know you're busy and you've got patients probably waiting for you. But I just wanted to ask you if there was any sources that you would like to mention quickly for our followers and viewers to find more information about what you're talking about. And as for the viewers, if there's any information shared with us, we always link it with these videos so that will have access.
So I always consider the MD Anderson website a good source of information. Our public relations team does a really good job at putting out the research that's being done, not only within our group, but within the institution. And there's a lot going on as to what pertains from KRAS. So I think that that would be a major source. But I'm more than happy to provide those contacts and those resources to you, Leah, so that you can share with your community. And like I said, I'm always happy to be a point of reference for you and in your community. If it facilitates access to MD Anderson, if it's informative to the patients, happy to support your efforts as best as I possibly can.
Well, we really appreciate that. And I think be careful what you wish for because you might get a lot of people knocking at your door.
It will be my pleasure. That's what we
Well,
do.
good. Good.
We help you guys through a very tough time in your life. So that's what we're here for.
Absolutely do. And thank you so much for being here this morning. And for those of you at home, make sure to follow. And if you missed the first or second episode, please go back and watch those because I think you're going to learn some very valuable information there as well. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you again for sharing all this beneficial information with our patient population.
Thank you so much, Leah. Once again, I really appreciate the invitation and looking forward to future opportunities to engage you in your community.
Yes, thank you.